And good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Your Life in Zoom that we're all experiencing, whether we like it or not these days. I'm very grateful to the Wellesley Historical Society for the invitation to examine the historical patterns of the Belvedere neighborhood. I've learned a lot from it and come away greatly impressed and look forward to sharing my observations with you. Before beginning, I'd like to thank some of the people that have made it possible for me to do this during the period of the COVID pandemic, including Mary Beth Sandman, who provided the beautiful photographs of many of the houses I'll show tonight. Cindy and Rob Jasko and other neighbors in the Belvedere area who provided me with historical photographs and architectural drawings of the houses that they own. I'm also very grateful to Taylor Collick for not only bowing out this evening so that someone else can attend, but for sharing the riches of the Wellesley historical collections and archives. And to Tom Payne and Dana Marks for clarifying questions I had about the historic district study and planning process. I need to be humble at the beginning and say I couldn't have done this without the prior work by Kathy Brunmer back in 1990 for the Massachusetts Historical Commission, where she did a thorough survey of the neighborhood. And even earlier, a master's thesis by a man named George Young, looking at the development activities of Isaac Sprague and Albion Clapp, who were so important in establishing the character of the Wellesley Hills and Wellesley Square neighborhood. So tonight, I want to begin to examine what it means to be a suburb, why it matters so much as a topic in the academic community and the public at large. The definition in some ways is painfully obvious. Some land, some trees, ideally, perhaps a picket fence. The ideal of separateness and privacy have all been assumed parts of the definition, but also embedded there is a belief that there's something distinctly American about the suburb as a typology. And indeed, even those architects and urban planners who recently have been calling themselves new urbanists have produced designs such as the one that you see in the lower right corner here that really look more like new suburbia or at least small village-like environments rather than anything specifically urban. I want to use a series of images to walk us back into the understanding of the suburb in the 19th and 20th century, starting with this, which is a diagram from the Architectural Journal Architectural Record in 1927 that was produced as an explanation for an article on country house architecture, as you can imagine from the large use of that image on the right-hand half of this diagram. But this pyramidal form is a reenactment of the understanding of American urbanism that emerged from the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. And it's a diagram that shows, obviously, the skyscraper or tall office building at the center, stepping down to apartment buildings, lingering urban residences, i.e. slums, apartment houses, semi-detached houses, and then the further zone is the country house area as understood at that time. If we consider the Boston complex more carefully, the most useful document is a book published in 1962 by a man who's the dean of the field of urban history in the United States, my former colleague Sam Bass-Warner. His book was called Streetcar Suburb, The Process of Growth in Boston from 1870 to 1890. And this diagram of the evolving metropolis is the core of his argument, one that saw this character of the city changing in relation to the form of transportation that was possible, beginning with the orange central core, which was the pedestrian or walkable city, moving out to the lighter orange circle around that, which is the peripheral streetcar suburbs from the 1850s onward, to ultimately the larger tan circle that is the new suburb as he understood it as it had evolved by 1900. Now, obviously, Wellesley was beyond the pale from his perspective in that it's off the map to the left, and certainly his model did not incorporate the concept of the private passenger automobile as key for this development. But the evolution of the suburb really begins much earlier and is a dialogue between English and American experimentation, although the United States becomes the key laboratory where most of the development occurs. I think a good candidate for an earlier example of suburbia is a project called Regents Park, which many of you probably are aware of and have visited in London. It was a former hunting estate created for Henry VIII that remained in the royal family and whose lease fell in the early 19th century, at which point the Prince Regent, then George IV, hence the name Regents Park, decided to grab this territory and turn it into a development process property on the edge of urban London at that time. Regents Park is created as an enormous green space. It now has the Regents Park Zoo. Then there were enormous terrace housing, all in white stucco around the perimeter, enjoying the view of the park. And along the northern edge is something called Regents Park Villages, east and west, that flanked the Regent's Canal, an industrial project also of the Prince Regent. And it was here in the meandering streets and isolated villas in differing historical styles from the Italianate to the Gothic Revival that the developer of this whole concept, James Burton, and his architect son, Decimus Burton, essentially does a test run for the idea of suburbia as it will evolve over the rest of the century. This was a plan of 1833. You can see the meandering streets and separate villas, houses that looked like this, all along these carefully controlled streets with attention to green space and different historical styles, but a uniform palette of white stucco, all, as I say, designed by an architect named Decimus Burton, although overseen by an older man named John Nash, with the best reputation in the country at that point, a man whose wife happened to be the mistress of the Prince of Wales. So you can see there was a little nepotism or internal politicking going on here as well. 2 decades later, the United States begins to pick up this model in varying ways. One principal example of that is something called Louellan Park in West Orange, New Jersey, that was developed beginning in 1853. It was 100 acres of land on the eastern slope of the Washtog Mountain in West Orange that was purchased by a man named Louellan Solomon Haskell, who was an importer of patent medicines and had made a substantial fortune in that operation. He sought a country residence not far from New York City, an easy train ride, and purchased this large plot of land, creating a house for himself at the highest promontory with a view back towards Manhattan, and then hiring an engineer named Eugene Bauman to lay out the lots and roads throughout the park, and throughout the plot, and to create a central park space along the valley of a stream bed that you see in this diagram. Those PR signs around the parklands all represent private residences, many of which were designed by an architect who was incorporated in this collaboration, a man named Alexander Jackson Davis, who designed many of the early villas within this domain, as well as the gate lodge that you see here in this rustic conical building that represented the entry point for the earliest example of a gated community in the United States. By the time the Louellan Park began to open in 1857, there was another important development happening back in Manhattan, which many of you I'm sure know about, and that is the creation of the massive Central Park to the designs of two men, a landscape planner named Frederick Law Olmsted and an architect named Calvert Vaux. The success of Central Park in the years before the Civil War led to other projects for these men after the war was over, including Prospect Park in Brookline, and a national reputation had then been established that allowed them to accept commissions of a whole series of different landscape forms, one of which was an invitation in 1869 to develop an entire large-scale suburban community called Riverside, Illinois, located 9 miles west of the Chicago Loop along the railroad corridor that you see running through the center of the project at the point where it intersects with the Des Plaines River, which, like the valley inside Louellan Park, in this case Olmsted, was responsible for turning this into parkland. This plan looks like a series of strange amoeboid shapes. You'll notice that the lots closest to the railroad are the smallest, and there was a democratic assumption here that the suburb was something that would be appropriate for all to engage in. The central core was for the commercial and public building district, and the rest were individual lots. The development of Riverside was somewhat stillborn because of the recession of 1873, interrupting the possibility of immediate realization. So it took several decades for it to achieve its form. But the advertising for Riverside, Illinois included this image that shows the park along the Des Plaines River with the happy suburbanites frolicking and playing along the banks, even a gondola down in the river, and very prominently, the essential railroad that provided the link back to the central city and beyond, the so-called machine in the garden running through the central core there. England doesn't stop with the original ideals there at Regents Park back in 1833, but rather at the end of the century, another new thrust of ideas about suburban living come from this rather grouchy looking individual that you see on the left, whose name is Ebenezer Howard. Howard was a Brit who had come to the United States as a young man and had briefly tried his hand at farming in Nebraska, which didn't come out very well for him. He retreated to the city of Chicago, where he became a court reporter and stenographer for a few years before returning to England in 1876, after which he worked in central London for a firm that produced the reports of parliamentary actions. But he spent most of the time really hating London, very disgruntled with his life and longing to escape for fresh air and a retreat into the countryside. His frustration produced two important books. The first, called Tomorrow, or A Peaceful Path to True Reform, published in 1898, and then followed 4 years later by a second book called Garden Cities of Tomorrow in 1902, in which he argued, as this diagram on the right suggests, that the railroad makes it possible to take the area surrounding metropolitan districts and connect them to nodes of small-scale development with a guarantee of agricultural districts, forest lands, and public parks in between for breathing space. His ideas caught the imagination of many in England, and within a few years, a trial run was created at a place called Letchworth, an hour north and east of London, where the architect Raymond Unwin created a master plan and then a whole village that looked sort of quaintly Old English, such as this set of interconnected houses with their thatched roofs and jerkin-headed gables and other forms that tried to make you think you were actually in the historic past rather than a new built environment. After the First World War, more examples, notably Wellesley Garden City, also by Parker and Unwin, were developed and became sites of pilgrimage for architects and planners from across the globe. In the United States, the fruit from these ideas was most conspicuously born in the planning of a model Garden City complex outside of New York City, sponsored by the Russell Sage Foundation, that was overseen by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the son of the man who had been responsible for Central Park and Riverside, Illinois. Fred Jr. Did the landscape planning, and a man named Grosvenor Atterbury designed all the buildings for this model suburban community. It is, as I say, called Forest Hills Garden, and the central square with the commercial district and the all too important railroad line, and you see the railroad station platform up at the top of the steps there, were all designed by Atterbury in this vaguely old English or old European, since tile roofs and then jerkin-headed gables were the principal vehicle for all of the architecture designed by the same design team of Olmsted and Atterbury, such as the street view that you see here. Notice the stucco house with a half timbering, a vaguely medieval form there, jerkin-headed gables, and large tile roof, all characteristic of this borrowing from the English and to an extent the European past. Now, most of these examples I've talked about were complete suburban communities with a single development mechanism, a power source and a financial source, and with house designers both for the landscape and for the architecture. But as most of us who lived in suburbs at any point realize, suburbs evolve incrementally over longer periods of time, and that's certainly the common pattern throughout the Boston area. I'm showing you here on the screen a small detail of what may well be the first example in the United States of a planned suburban neighborhood, something called Linden Place, that you can see on this diagram. Linden Place was completed in 1843. It was the work of a landscape designer named Alexander Wadsworth. Consisted of 27 lots with small park areas planned into the mix, such as the one here, right in this area. And it was located near, and still is, Brookline Village at a time when Brookline was beginning to experience a rush of development and suburbanization. Because as some of you know, in 1821, a causeway was built from the Shawmut Peninsula, the area of the Boston Common and Public Garden, along the line of modern day Beacon Street out to the shore of Brookline, and the areas that were closest to the end of that causeway began to be areas, laboratories for new development and suburban experimentation. That first example was interesting because it was carefully controlled. The man who provided the money, Thomas Aspinwall Davis, became the mayor of Boston, ironically, the year after it was begun. And he was living in Brookline while being mayor of Boston at the same time. It had restrictions on it that no African Americans or no people of Irish descent were allowed to live in the neighborhood. That became a component, but not the common component of suburbanization, although it's one of the sort of unpleasant byproducts for some suburban communities. Brookline, though, really moved into a completely different phase, a completely different volume of suburban development when in 1883, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. moved his family and his office from Staten Island and New York to suburban Brookline and established an office from which over the next 50 years, his firm and its descendants continue to be among the most dominant landscape architects in the country. Soon after his arrival, he began to receive multiple commissions in Brookline. Indeed, the firm received 150 commissions in the period of their activity. Two important examples of which I show you on the screen now from 1886. At the top is a design of Beacon Street as it extended out from the causeway into Brookline and all the way out to the Chestnut Hill Reservoir in that direction, along a very carefully planned landscaped boulevard, a diagram of which, a cross-section of which you see here. And hopefully you can see that in the center was the streetcar trolley line, since this was a development for Henry Whitney, the streetcar magnate, who basically exploded the streetcar network throughout the Boston area. But here did it in a very careful way. Flanking that is a bridle path, then a driveway for carriages, an area for bicycles, and also a pedestrian walkway. A perfect diagram for what I wish had become a model throughout the Boston area. We'd be in a better state today than we are if it had been. In the same year, 1886, closer to where Olmsted lived, 6 neighbors who owned property on what was then called Brookline Hill invited the Olmsted office to create a master plan for its suburban development. It later became known as Coolidge Hill, and you see its diagram down here at the bottom near the Brookline Reservoir, just appearing down here at the bottom of the screen. Now, Brookline then becomes a site for important experimentation, both individual properties and combined group efforts, such as the Beacon Street or the Coolidge Hill environment we were just looking at. Another key way in which Brookline becomes a launching pad for suburbia in the greater Boston area, and in terms of being a model nationally too, was through the nexus between planned communities. In this case, I'm showing you a section of Longwood, one of 2 communities on either side of Beacon Street, developed in the 1840s and 50s, the other being Cottage Farm, developed by the Sears and Lawrence families. The Unity Church on the top of the hill was a gift to that community from the Sears family. And then down below is the Longwood train station, which is directly on the Riverway, part of the Boston Municipal Park System that Olmsted was creating as well. From sites like this in Brookline, we then see the extension of the railroad beginning in 1880 when the Boston and Albany Railroad line purchases the New York and New England Railroad that loops out through Newton and ultimately comes all the way out to Wellesley, where we find stations such as this one for Wellesley Hills, built in 1886. The final collaboration between 2 Brookline neighbors. I'm just going to go back for one moment here. If we go back to the Longwood Station, you have the Longwood Station and its grounds designed, grounds designed by Olmsted, the station by his friend and neighbor H.H. Richardson, perhaps best known as the architect of Trinity Church, and then the Parkway by Olmsted adjacent to it. And then, whoops, sorry, wrong direction. We need to come out to Wellesley itself, where the Wellesley Hill Station of 1886 was designed in the year of Richardson's death. The important and a distinctive element of these stations is that they're low ground-hugging designs in granite and brownstone that then are encased in a landscape that Olmsted designed not only the station grounds, but even the corridor along which the railroad passed, bringing people out to further and further suburban locations. In this case, obviously, when you cross from the station, you come into what will become the Belvedere neighborhood at its Abbott Road entrance. But we need to back up slightly and remind ourselves of the issues that make Wellesley distinctive as a community. Of course, Wellesley initially is part of West Dedham and remains connected to that earlier settlement until the residents of this area of West Dedham finally petition to break off and form a separate community, a community that comes to be called Wellesley in 1881 as a nod to the great benefactor of the community, Horatio Hollis Honeywell, who was married to Isabella Wells in London in 1836. And then they returned to the United States in 1837 during the recession of that year and began to live in their summertime at property that had been acquired by the Wells family as early as 1763. In 1851, they moved into this wonderful house, still owned by the family, that was designed by Arthur Gilman, with very substantial grounds, as you all know, around it, where the Honeywells developed a series of different garden typologies, including perhaps most distinctively the Italianate garden, this clipped topiary sort of series of viewing platforms looking down and terracing down to Lake Louellan. That was certainly the largest of the country houses that were erected in the Wellesley area, and others supplemented by the children of Horatio Hollis Honeywell and his wife Isabel around Lake Louellan. But others were also attracted to the rolling landscape of Wellesley. An important figure in this case is Judge Josiah Abbott, who came to Wellesley in 1863, began to assemble parcels of property in the area that we'll be focusing on with the Belvedere district in a moment. He moved in 1884 to a 12-acre estate on Linden Street between Linden and the Worcester Turnpike in those years, where his close neighbor and an earlier resident was the Sprague family that we'll be talking about in relation to Belvedere too. Both the Spragues and the Abbotts become key shapers of not only that neighborhood, but much of the Wellesley Hills district. Here you see the country house that had been the home of Judge Abbott and his children, and the plan from an atlas of those days, as well as his handsome photograph there on the right-hand side. And then we come to the character of the land that he had begun to assemble that equals well over 150 acres, a landscape that was still quite open and rolling, an agricultural district, as represented by this 1880s photograph of the Whiting House on Forest Street, taken according to the record, and this is the photograph from the Wellesley Historical Society collection, a photograph taken by Mary H. White sometime in that decade. It gives us both a sense of the innate character of the landscape, and also helps us to understand that what ultimately becomes the Belvedere neighborhood and district is a totally artificially constructed, idealized natural world, as was so much the case with the Olmsted planning in Boston that we've looked at before. After the death of Judge Abbott in 1891. His surviving children decide that they will subdivide much of the property that they had inherited and begin the process of creating a suburban environment, much as they would be aware of in other sections that are closer to the central core of Boston, such as Brookline, Newton, and elsewhere. In 1894, they hire the civil engineers, Aspinwall and Lincoln, based in Boston, and also had done substantial work in Brookline as well, to create this master plan for a new environment that would be laid out along these meandering streets that engage or respect the typography of the neighborhood, much as we've seen in all of these earlier examples. They call the development area Belvedere, which is named after a residential section of Lowell, Massachusetts, where they had grown up as children. And Belvedere begins its life with this plan of 1894, and then active sales of property in the following year. I'd also bring your eyes' attention to the stamp name of Carter and Peabody, the selling agents on Washington Street in Boston. J.W. Peabody becomes a key partner with both the Abbott children and with the Sprague Trust, the real estate trusts that form after that. The original development can be understood by looking at this 1897 Wellesley Atlas that shows the properties, including J.W. Peabody's house right there, and others that had been constructed up till that point, primarily along Abbott and then Livermore Road. Obviously, Abbott and Livermore are family names. Mrs. Abbott's maiden name was Livermore, and Fletcher and some of the other names in the neighborhood are also derived from the Abbott children. In 1909, this man, we've already referenced, Isaac Sprague, comes onto the scene as the person who will purchase the remaining undeveloped land of the estate, the neighborhood, and extend it much more quickly and ambitiously, and with an even greater emphasis on the quality of design and the character of architecture in the environment. You can see on the right a brochure for the Belvedere Abbott Road development in Wellesley Hills. One of the houses we'll be looking at in a moment, and the name Maugus Real Estate Trust, which was the third of a series of trusts that Sprague had founded with others. And you can see Carter and Peabody are still the selling agents, and Peabody himself becomes a partner with Sprague in these developments. Here you see that same diagram from before, with the exception that it's now called the Maugus Real Estate Trust. I don't know what the pink was intended to represent. It probably were those properties that were available for development at that moment. But this represents the changes and expansions that happened after November 3rd of 1909, when it's purchased by the Sprague enterprise. The study commission that's been looking intensely at the development of the neighborhood has produced a very useful diagram that some of you may have seen, that in both the plan and the chart in the upper corner helps us to see how the neighborhood grew incrementally, beginning in the orange district that represents the 1890s, then the houses in this light brown, the first decade of the 20th century, and obviously a major expansion in the teens. Healthy development continued in the 20s, and despite the Depression, into the 1930s, when much, but not all, of the neighborhood had been built out. The district is one that had two different phases of development that I'll try and quickly characterize. And if any of you are interested in this, I'd be glad to send you a copy of this chart. Josiah Abbott's heirs were involved from 1894 to 1909. During that period of time, they sold 60 lots. They required people to spend a bare minimum of $4,000 in the construction of the house on their property. They required specific setbacks of feet from the road and from adjacent properties, and they advertised fairly locally and modestly through the Wellesley townsmen. When Sprague and his partners in the Maugus Real Estate Trust take over in 1909, they expand and rename some of the roads. They increase the character of the setback and the side spacing. They initially require a $5,000 minimum, and then a decade later in 1919, they increased that to $8,000. And in the first 4 years, Sprague sold 60 lots, equal to the entire time for the Abbott children, and then expanded rapidly thereafter. Now, the neighborhood is sort of encased by two social and athletic organizations that I think are important to understanding the character of the environment, even though they are not specifically byproducts of either the Abbott or the Sprague enterprise. The one closest to the entrance to the development from the train station on Abbott Road, of course, is the Maugus Club, founded in 1892, that purchased the estate of the Bemis family at 1440 Abbott Road and expanded it into the clubhouse and athletic facility you see here in 1895, which stood until it burned to the ground in 1953, as I'm sure many of you know, and has been rebuilt at that site. Perhaps less well known is the fact that golf also played a role in the development of the Belvedere neighborhood, in that in 1897, the Wellesley Hills Golf Club was created on some of the unsold land furthest from the entrance to the development. And that continued until after Sprague took over in 1909. After that, in 1910, this group of individuals purchased the land of the former West Needham Poor Farm along its furthest border to create the Wellesley Country Club. They were inheriting a site that had been the West Dedham Town Hall, and also the Poor Farm, or debtor's prison, if you will. It was used for a whole range of health and incarceration activities over the years, and continued in new service in a second building for the Wellesley Country Club until its eventual demolition in 2008 for the current clubhouse that you know today. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times that J.W. Peabody was the selling agent, and I think people who are real estate agents don't often get the credit they deserve in the history of real estate development, but Peabody is a special case in that he was one of the first people to build his own house within the new Belvedere district at 48 Abbott Road, probably in 1896, because the town of Wellesley didn't begin to keep building permits until 1913. The dating and the architects and other information for early houses is a little less definite. But here's J.W. Peabody's house. He came from very humble beginnings. He actually was born in that poor farm, the West Dedham Poor Farm, and rose substantially in the world, especially through his collaboration with both the Abbotts and with the Spragues. Now, when I showed you that early diagram from 1927 that attempted to create the pyramid expansion from the center to the edge, that outer zone was called the Country House District. And in some ways, you have to sort of negotiate in the early development of the of this Belvedere neighborhood as to whether these are actually suburban homes or country houses. The example that most conspicuously seems more of a country house than a suburban residence is the 1902 Charles Schirmer commission to Clarence H. Blackall, a noted Boston architect, to create the house that you see in the photograph at the top and in the drawings down below. A house that 2 years later was purchased by Waldo Elliott Pratt, a 5-acre component that has remained in the Pratt family until today, with the exception of one period of interruption. And it is an extremely well-documented site and a very substantial, more country house than suburban residence. More characteristic of the development of the neighborhood would be the example of the S.A. Fay House at 72 Abbott Road that probably dates from 1895, 96. And again, it may be a candidate for one of the earliest houses in the neighborhood, although I dare say Peabody probably got there first. Here you see a characterization of what the neighborhood's quality will be. An emphasis on an easy spreading horizontality, reinforced by deep eaves and a generous porch wrapping around the ground floor. A boulder foundation then moves up into shingled upper stories, and it is embowered then in a generous landscape with mature now trees creating a glorious canopy overhead. So keep in mind setback, the importance of landscaping, the significance of the trees, as well as the character of the architecture. One of the early houses that we have more specific information on is the house at 90 Abbott Road from probably 1900 or approximately 1900. On the right, you see part of the blueprint saved by the Casper family that used to live in this house and kindly sent me a photograph of the plans they have. The house was designed by Ernest N. Boyden. We'll talk about the architects working in the neighborhood a little later. Boyden was based at 35 Congress Street in central Boston and was designing houses throughout the greater Boston area, as well as other types of buildings that we can talk about. You can see here that it's still modest in scale. It probably was intended as a development house rather than something built for a specific client, as had been the case with the Schirmer Pratt house we saw a moment ago. And other early houses along Abbott Road, such as 102, have a similar character of that reliance still on a connectivity to nature through the boulder course of the ground floor of the porch and part of the house, moving up into this transverse gambrel roof massing with two very prominent bay dormers projecting on the front with little eyebrow windows, one on top of the other, set in between. Another well-documented house and one that represents the continuity from the earlier phases of the Abbott family to the Sprague Maugus Trust is this house at 101 Appleton Street that dates from 1909. We're fortunate in having, thanks to the owners, the actual plan of this house that doesn't include the name of an original client. So this is a speculator house, as I think many of them probably were in the early days. It was the work of an architect named Luther Greenleaf, who does a lot of houses in the neighborhood. And as I say, we'll come back to him later too. Just want to flip through a few more examples of houses. Here's one of a similar character, also from 1909, perhaps a little more compact, a little more clearly indebted to an interest in the Colonial revival stylistic formula with a garage, a two-car garage in the backyard that is a separate structure, as were most of those that were built later. Carriage houses would have been common for those that could afford them at first. The surprise exception in the early development of the neighborhood was a house, or is a house, that's located at 15 Windsor Road, built in 1913 to 14. And unlike all of the other ones I've been able to identify who are using Boston area architects as the designers, in this case, this is a pattern book house that comes out of the work of a man named Gustav Stickley, a furniture maker turned amateur architect and a great self-publicist, both through a journal called The Craftsman that he published from 1901 onward, and a series of books such as Craftsman Homes and More Craftsman's Homes from 1909 to 1912. And diagram 149 that you see here on the right was used for the house located at 15 Windsor Road, although in the 1930s it was quite substantially rebuilt. This is not the original house. This is Gustav Stickley's own house that sort of caricatures his intent rusticity, his reliance on low massing and spreading roofs, his love of boulders, and indeed, in this case, even log construction. Now, I mentioned before that many of these early houses were working in the most popular mode for residential architecture, perhaps from the late 19th century into the 21st century, and that is the Colonial Revival style. Here's a particularly fine and larger example at 139 Abbott Road, designed by the firm of Gay and Proctor in 1909. It certainly has imposing scale. It's at a corner site, so it even has more than one principal facade. This one shows 7 bays with a central pavilion going up to a white painted projecting pediment, a house that says almost Southern Plantation or something of a much grander scale. This is a design by Gay and Proctor, probably the most favored architect of the Sprague Development Corporations. And here's a slightly later and slightly smaller example, this one from 1925 at 129 Abbott Road by Benjamin Proctor again. A gambrel roof here is now punctured by these 3 projecting pedimented dormers and a continuous porch across the front, much more like earlier architecture in the neighborhood. Here, a reference to Dutch colonial design, which obviously has no particular reference to the Boston area, but was popular throughout the country at that moment. There's another key thread that I can trace throughout the entire neighborhood, and that is something that is more picturesque, more varied in its massing, that includes medieval components, such as the half timbering in this very distinctive formula there over the entrance porch, as well as then a fan pediment of the colonial variety over the door hidden underneath. What this would have been called Queen Anne or Old English architecture in its earlier days, and that ideal continued at a much larger scale in buildings like the Preston Bryant House at 123 Abbott Road from approximately 1905, with its splayed eaves here and multiple gables, and then this wonderful multiple story projecting staircase tower here to the right of the entrance door. This continues on to the later phases of development in the neighborhood, such as this example from 1927 at 108 Abbott Road, designed by an architect named Christopher Crowell, who was more of a real estate developer than an architect, but nevertheless, by using brick at the ground story, the half timbering of the medieval tradition up here in the gables, and then a rough stucco finish in these twin gable fronts, he's engaging with that more characteristic medieval past. I'll leave you with the importance of Sprague, not only in Wellesley Hills, but in Wellesley Square nearby, Wellesley Farms nearby. His role in the community and his many benefactions are recognized by the Isaac Sprague Memorial Tower of 1928 in the center, located in Elm Park, and therefore not part of the Belvedere district. But then the two buildings that you see to either side are ones which, like the tower, were all designed by the same architect, Benjamin Proctor. On the right-hand half of the screen, we have the Wellesley Trust Company building of 1928, and on the left, what was originally the Belvedere apartment building of 1930, all using handsome local stone, either rough rubble or dressed masonry. Now, I'm going to just very briefly bring these architects into view, and I realize we're about to run out of time, for which I apologize. Here's a list of all of the architects, Luther Greenleaf and Benjamin Proctor being the most prominent. We have architects working here, such as Clarence Blackall, an important early skyscraper designer for what it's worth in downtown Boston, theaters, synagogues, or ephemeral buildings like Out of Town News in Harvard Square. Then we have the work of a man named Ernest Boyden, who is important in the development of the western end of the Back Bay of Boston, such as this 7-story apartment building at 197 Marlborough Street. It's attempting at ground floor to look like the adjacent single-family residences. On the right are houses in the suburbs. This is the Case Estate in Weston, and a house in the Fisher Hill Historic District of Brookline. I think I may have misspoke earlier in calling Fisher Hill District the Coolidge Hill District. That's in Cambridge, so my apologies for that. Another important architect is Luther Greenleaf, who worked in an area of Brookline called now the Gaffin-McKay Historic District. The house on the left here was the house that in 1920, Joseph and Rose Kennedy purchased after their expanding family had outgrown their earlier Brookline residence, and their 5th through 7th children from Eunice through Robert were born here. This house and the two that you see here on the right, all nearby each other on Abbott Road in Brookline, were the work of Greenleaf and his partner. And finally, Edward Stratton, who does work late in the development of the Belvedere neighborhood, was an important hotel architect in downtown Boston, from the Lenox Hotel to the Puritan Hotel on Commonwealth Avenue that you see here on the right. Perhaps I should close by saying that an important component of the neighborhood is the commitment to green space and the sort of holiness of nature for this whole environment, beginning along the Fuller Brook Parkway, which both Abbott and Peabody become involved with, and then on to the creation of landscape spaces around houses such as the Pratt House here, or in the collections of the Wellesley Historical Society, the wonderful work of a local landscape architect named Charles P. Gorley, Jr., whose work you see in these examples. Suburbia becomes a different enterprise after the Second World War as returning veterans and superhighways expand the possibility and the pressure to create more and smaller residential communities. And ultimately, in the late 20th and early 21st century, the suburb seems to be something that is an endless continuum. The suburb becomes the word sprawl, which has a pejorative sense and is a stark contrast to the great character that the Belvedere district exemplifies in any one of the examples we could look at. I've chosen the John Ramsey House of 1914 here as my poster image for the end of the lecture. It's broad lawn, deep setback, mature and varied trees, generous and spreading architecture with some minor references to classical detailing, and yet a desire ultimately for a comfortable and spacious residence in nature, driving the creation of this and much of the rest of the environment. This area is to be prized and cherished as an environment of distinction, and I've had a great time learning about it, for which I thank you. I'm afraid we'll have to take questions over the internet because this has gone on longer than our time slot. So good evening, everyone, and thanks for your attention. I hope I can answer any questions you may have, and I turn this briefly back over to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Keith, for such an incredible presentation. I know that everyone very much appreciated the insight into the architectural history of the region, as well as the Belvedere neighborhood, and having it brought into a larger context. Should anyone have any questions with regards to, sorry, I apologize, I forgot I had stopped my video. Should anyone have any questions with regards to this particular lecture, please feel free to send me an email. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me, and in turn I will confer with both Keith as well as my colleague, our archivist and collections manager, Taylor Kallick. And my email is director@wellesleyhistoricalsociety, all one word, .org. And you can find this information as well on our website. And in addition, it is our intent that this recording will be used for future viewing opportunities. I know a lot of your friends and family were unable to join us this evening, so please feel free to share this with them at a future juncture. And additionally, I very much want to thank all of you for your support of the Wellesley Historical Society. Please continue to visit our website, as well as following us on Instagram. We have two different Instagram handles, at Tollhouse229. We now have our Toll House shop online. You can also find that on our website, as well as our at Wellesley Historical Instagram for the organization itself, and we advertise our programs and events there, as well as our Facebook page. And I wish everyone a really wonderful and calm rest of your evening. Thank you so much again. Enjoy your night.